Clara, you are an economist. I am an auditor. And I like to think that people in our particular professions, if we're doing our job well, are probably upsetting some people sometimes. And so I wanted to begin with an article you had written about ethical consumerism, because I can imagine a person could read this, and if they really took to heart your message, might be a little upset about it, what its implications are. I happen to agree with your premise and your conclusions, but I can understand some individuals just would have a knee-jerk reaction to reject that. So let me set this up. Ethical consumerism, I mean, it could go by a bunch of different names, maybe a bunch of different definitions, but this is sort of when you go to the store, you see something that's buy local or fair trade or ethically sourced or free trade, right? We want to purchase things that we know that the product, especially if it's like an animal product, was treated ethically and humanely. We want to know that the things we're purchasing are not going to do to bad people or bad companies, if you will. And then you assert maybe a better model would be, especially from a family's perspective, to buy things the family needs within budget. Because this idea that we can just see the sticker on there that says, fair trade doesn't necessarily give us all the information we need to know that our dollars are actually doing good and not harm. And so it's maybe a ham-fisted way to set it up, but I wanted to start there to just ask, have I got your argument right? And if so, I guess leading into that, why is it problematic, say, for an individual to focus first on, oh, well, I want my dollars to be going to companies that are doing good?
Yes, no, I'm happy to get into this. Um, basically, the argument is that, as you said, the main good that family members, specifically parents, should be pursuing in their consumption decisions, right? Because from the economic perspective, we're always going to be making trade-offs, right? We want to have all of the goods, and we have to order them, we have to rank them appropriately. And so this is an ethical argument that the main good that should be pursued is, does this fulfill the needs of my family members, right? So is it a quality product that will actually get the job done? And then B, does it fit in the budget? Those are two essential things that need to be addressed first. And then, right, you can consider, well, I really like this brand, or I really prefer these features, or I want to support this small business, right, or other considerations. What I'm really trying to say is it's not bad necessarily, right, to buy fair trade or at a local business or go to the farmer's market. I love my local farmer's market here in Oxford, Mississippi. But that the first consideration really does need to be, does it serve the needs of my family? And sometimes those two things can be in conflict, right? Because fair trade and other labels, ethically sourced, are brands, you tend to pay more for them because there's more kind of a bureaucratic process or organic food's a good example, right? There's a process that these companies, these producers have to go through to provide it and then being able to have that label. So sometimes you won't be able to make those choices just because they don't fit in your budget. And what I'm kind of trying to tell parents is that's okay. That's not your main purpose, right? In the market is not actually providing support for businesses that you like or want to see more of, which is okay. But again, it's really just feeding your kids. And it's okay to go to Walmart. And actually, Walmart does have a lot of positive things that it gives to the community as well, in terms of jobs and lowering food insecurity. And so I'm being thankful just for the blessings of cheap food, relatively abundant goods, and knowing that those help you fulfill your role as a parent.
So, and I'm trying to think of what you're sharing from the perspective of, say, a single person who their main goal is not necessarily the consumerism on behalf of their family. And usually when we talk about these the classic example, at least that I hear, is often chickens, how they are treated. If I go into a grocer and I've got a choice of a dozen eggs over here and over here, and let's just say, for a fictitious example, obviously this wouldn't ordinarily happen, but they both cost the exact same thing. But I know that company A sings lullabies to the chicken at night and company B beats them with rubber hoses. I'm going to buy from company A, right? All things being equal. And I think most of us would still buy from company A, even if they're more expensive, because we presume it's doing good for the chicken. That being said, that's, in my experience, that's usually about as far as the thinking goes. It's ethically sourced, like we get some sort of a direct, here's how we treat this animal, or here's how I love the products that claim that all profits go to not-for-profits or something to that degree, which may be true, but I have no way, again, I'm an auditor, I have no way to verify that. And how are they defining profits? Because, if the machinery breaks down, are they just out of business now because they've they've given all their profits out? And so I'm wondering, could you dig a little deeper for us? Um, what is it about the? I heard you in a podcast talk about, and I love the short essay "I Pencil." What is it about just human nature that we, I think, come into this world with what I would call an underdeveloped appreciation or sense of the complexity of the price system and the free market, and how we don't actually, as humans, really have the capacity to say, well, if I pull this lever over here, it does good or bad things over here.
Excellent. Yes. I'm glad you brought up iPencil, because the idea of trying to do good by purchasing ethically, and again, if this just means kind of following these labels and these brands, which sometimes actually aren't great indicators of ethical behavior, because there's always going to be ways to sell what they want to sell. And so the complication with that approach is that the production process of something like a chicken egg doesn't just start with the chicken. And it doesn't even just start with, right, that farm where the chicken is. There are a lot of parts that go into it. There's the coffee that's drunk by the workers that then go to the farm. And then there's what about the truck drivers who are driving the eggs, right? Are you ensuring that every one of those people, right? So maybe I think it makes sense to first be concerned about the treatment of the people in those production processes. Are they all, treated well, receiving just wages, all of this? Well, that's virtually impossible to ascertain if you have an eye pencil perspective and you understand that everything is very interconnected. And so it's better to think about, and I think from a moral perspective, we're not asked to do the impossible. We're asked to do kind of what is in front of us, and to serve the people in our lives well. And even as a single person, right, to consume wisely. And again, within your budget, I think it's important to say, because it's not, it can seem like boring, but that's actually a noble thing, to stay within your budget and to use your resources well. And so, not to get kind of carried away with extensive research, or worrying about trying to spend a dollar and not only get a good, but also get this good feeling, right, that we're doing some sort of virtuous activity, but knowing that it's enough, right, to purchase the things that we need, the eggs for breakfast in the morning. Thank goodness, right, that's been provided for us by the market, and then focus our activity on doing other forms, right, of good, right? Not just trying to, trying to escape the fact that there are always going to be trade-offs, in the sense that you cannot know for certain whether or not this production process was completely just. What you can know for certain is, and what you do have control over, is your own actions, right? Are those just or unjust? And so trying to clarify some thinking, hopefully relieve some anxiety over purchasing decisions, because it is a luxury to be able to choose, right, between different types of eggs, between clean energy or whatever, right? It's a big luxury. So to take a step back and not get carried away in thinking about those particular moral decisions, but focusing on the things that we have control over.
And the reason I opened with this notion that, and again, I'm just as guilty as an auditor, you economists upset people sometimes, is that while I do think and hope and expect that an essay of this sense has that effect, relieves anxiety, right? I don't have to worry about which eggs are actually doing which good. It's more, well, what's the nutritional value? And, the things that are in my control, it turns out I can be a, air quotes, good person just by focusing on those things. That being said, there are a lot of people, and I know he's an imperfect example, but I'll just use him because it's the one that's springing to mind. Jordan Peterson was asked, he was given a lecture once, and somebody essentially asked him from the audience, but what do we do about climate change? Like, this is important, and it's, we need to do something about it. And Peterson, didn't necessarily say we do or don't do something about climate change, but he was trying to get this individual to refocus. You probably can't do anything about climate change, but you can do things about your life that maybe in totality would have some impact on climate change, but isn't necessarily you solving some, collective problem that no one individual could possibly solve. And this person took great offense to this. And I think in a sense it was almost a questioning of their moral framework. They need to act in a manner that they understand as ethical or moral. And to suggest that they can't move the needle on climate change, or that their purchasing power can't actually guarantee they're doing good and not evil, just almost seems like an immoral affront to them. So how would you respond to an individual who says, "Look, I get what you're saying, but I, I have to believe that my dollars are doing good, and I have to put my effort into that"?
Well, let me first take the case where I'm not trying to say that like every time we spend money that it's a good thing, or that we don't need to consider the production process or the treatment of the workers or things like this. There are some products that I, for one, think it would be unethical to demand, right, to consume at all, because those production processes are inherently unjust and inherently immoral. So it's really important to have those lines. But what I'm trying to say is that most firms, most production processes are going to be more of that complicated mix, right? There's going to be good things that go on. There's probably going to be bad things that go on, and they're going to be out of our control. And what we're doing when we're consuming things is we're not able to solve all the problems in the world, right? We are trying to fulfill certain goods. And actually, there are other things, right, where we try to solve different problems when it comes to, our activity in our civic life, our activity in our churches, in our clubs, in our local governments, right? Those are maybe better arenas for trying to solve those bigger problems that people recognize. And I do think rightly feel some consternation about, right? Things like climate change, or things like unjust wages, or unfair, just poverty in general, right? Those things are important, but it's important to recognize what you can and can't do, right, with every decision. And this ties into, and maybe this is also where you're trying to move this conversation, this ties into a debate, a long-standing debate in business ethics about what is the role of a firm in society? What is the
Mm-hmm.
role of business in society, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so Milton Friedman will famously argue that the role of a business in society is to turn a profit, is to serve consumers products and services that they think are valuable. And the signal for that happening is profit. And the signal that that's not happening, that you're not providing something that people value, is not profit, is not turning a profit. And it can be tricky because one of the important things to recognize is that prices do not signal objective values. They are picking up on subjective values, right? So and everyone knows this, your wage is not an indicator of your objective value. It's an indicator of how people value the labor services that you're providing. But again, how people value things, that could be wrong, right? So again, there are some things that people value that I might think are wrong or mistaken and shouldn't have that price or shouldn't even be produced, right? But that's a separate discussion, right? Again,
Mm-hmm.
there is this longstanding argument. I tried not to get into it in this article. It's a shorter article, but that's kind of one of the things that I was contributing to, was saying, well, as long as it's not this intrinsic evil, right? Again, there's no slavery, or for myself, right? It's not coming from abortion or something like this. There's not a serious intrinsic evil, then your ethical responsibility is first, right? Is this a high quality product? Is this a business that I would like to see turn a profit? Or is this a business that I don't think should turn a profit because it's not providing value?
Far be it from me to object to Milton Friedman's views, which I almost always agree with. But this is trying to think of how to express this. There's one area where I just sort of intuitively, and I don't have this real well fleshed out. Uh, just go with me here for a moment. Um, what would your response be? And I don't know if you take Milton's view. I don't know if you take Milton's side on all issues. But to me, where that argument seems to break down is when we get to, well, an American firm is now doing business. In order to do business in China, the CCP dictates you can't talk about the ethnic cleansing of the Uyghurs, or you can't acknowledge Taiwan's nationhood. And it just seems, honestly, I wouldn't even say ethically sometimes. I just feel insulted as an American that an American business is kowtowing to some other country, powerful though they may be, just on the basis of purely profit-driven motives. Now, I know I'm approaching that. I know a lot of the left would take issue and say, look, there's a lot of, if you're just worried about purely profit-driven, what about all the other harm corporations are doing? Say, why would you pick just this one thing? But that is one area where I have a hard time clearing the Milton Friedman hurdle, if you will, and just saying, nope, all I care about is the firm focused on its profit, because that's what's in the best interest of its shareholders.
Mm-hmm. No, this is a really good question, and again, one that's been picked up in this debate, and specifically when it comes to things like sweatshops or other forms of, like, again, maybe not using intrinsic evils in the production process, so there's no outright slavery, right? Because I think Friedman would even would kind of understand that that's outside of, right, turning a profit, right, as your moral obligation. Um, and then economists would say, and I'll be honest, I don't kind of like walk in step with Friedman the whole way. And I'm not exactly sure where I fall in some of these debates, but I do think that there's an important argument on the other side, which is that economists would say it is important to provide people with alternatives. And so what we see when there are companies that are doing business with China, right? So are employing Chinese workers in a factory, for instance, making T-shirts or something, or they've opened up a so-called sweatshop, right, in, I don't know, Thailand or something. We see that and we say, okay, these are really rough conditions, and there's some compromises being made, right? Because these countries don't have the same standards, don't have the same legal codes, right, that we have for the treatment of workers, for the treatment of animals, et cetera, for, again, pollution, all of these things. So a lot of people can get behind this. But economists say, well, what you're not seeing, though, is that the people, again, aside from the case of outright slavery, people are choosing voluntarily to work with, right, these American companies, or to work in these factories. And we can presume from that choice that they are trading off some other inferior alternative, right? So in some cases, maybe the alternative is something like prostitution or something like starvation, right? Some worse alternative. So yes, maybe the standards aren't the same as we can afford in the United States, but marginal changes are really important, right? Being able to work in inside versus outside, right? That's a small change. It's not ideal, but it's a small change that would really actually help people on the path towards a better life. So maybe just a word of caution. And again, it can be complicated when it comes to like international trade and doing business abroad, because every
Sure.
country has its own laws. So I'm not exactly sure on like the policies, right? That's a different kind of, I think, perspective, again, with also like national security, all of these things. But when it comes to thinking about ethically what's going on, we could still actually make a good case that something like a sweatshop, an American company having a factory in a developing country, is a positive for that society, purely on the basis of that business existing, because they're providing alternatives to worse alternatives for people, right? Again, assuming that it's voluntary employment. So that's a kind of that's my portrayal, right, of this argument coming from economists, thinking about the unseen, right, thinking about what would be going on if that wasn't in existence as an option.
Yeah, and that's and granted, probably coming up with some concrete examples and talking through those might flesh that out a bit more. But I don't want to dwell on that too much. I wanted to, um, yeah, I'm just going to give in to the temptation to jump to the Soviet family policy, because in preparation for this, I listened to, I think it was no fewer than 3 podcasts I heard you on, in which the host mentions, oh, and you're also interested or had done some research on Soviet family policy. That's interesting. And you even make a statement to the effect, yeah, that's wild. And then they never follow up with another question. And I'm like, let's
Yes.
talk about that. That sounds kind of wild. So the Soviet Union, because that's sort of the ultimate, right, of collectivists. Hey, we're going to right the wrongs of this world through through our sheer understanding of the price system and what the air quotes correct price is to be. Um, what do we Westerners not understand about what the Soviets tried with family policy?
Yes. So first of all, thank you for this question. I've been waiting a very long time for it. And
Happy to oblige.
yes, no, I'm really happy it caught your attention, because I think that we really need to learn the lessons from the Cold War era and from the Soviet Union. And I don't think that they've been fully um, expanded upon. And so what should we know about Soviet family policy? Well, the first thing to know, and a lot of people do know this, is that the family is one of the key institutions that Marxist thought attempts to get rid of, obliterate, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really is actually the nexus. And so Engels will call this, it is the key institution where there's private property, there's tradition, there's religion, all of the things that we hate, right? And so like we need to get rid of the family.
Incidentally, sorry to interrupt, but Edmund Burke says sort of the same thing, but he didn't hate it. He said this is the building block of society.
Exactly right. No, exactly right. And I think a lot of people would agree with that. would agree with that statement. Is really it's kind of the linchpin of a lot of the other institutions in society, right, that are holding up civilization. So, um, the early policy in the Soviet Union was attempting to get rid of the family. And so my approach to this is to say, well, um, looking at Soviet family policy is instructive because it wasn't a democracy. It was really like the interest of the party prevailed. So they made the policy that was in their interest. And initially, um, the party, and specifically Lenin, um, benefited from reducing what I call familial production, or just reducing cooperation in the household and basically getting women into the factories to work. So they introduced unilateral divorce. They banned religious marriage, which was a really big deal because the Russian Orthodox Church had been governing the family and family law, and they have pretty strict regulations on divorce. They banned religious marriage, and they banned things like inheritance and adoption. So there's this line where they say that children have no claim to the property of the parents, and parents have no claim to the property of the children. Really
Hmm.
trying to just break
Mm-hmm.
up this institution.
So it almost sounds like just short of literally outlawing the family, they essentially make it bereft of all its benefits, if you will.
Yes, right. That's the goal. Is a lot of like feminist writing at this time. A lot of Soviet um, legislators are saying the ultimate goal, right, is to replace the family with collective child rearing,
Right.
essentially. And
Right.
then some people are like into free love, some people aren't. So it's not sure what'll happen to like men and women, but like definitely collectivize the rearing of children, which is like the primary function. If we think about the family as a firm, as we do in economics, that is like the primary output. Families produce people.
Mm-hmm.
The problem with this is that even autocratic regimes like the Soviet Union, they need people. And so this doesn't become a problem in the short run. You can do without people. You can do without new people, new taxpayers, new laborers, new soldiers for a while and be okay. And you'll actually get a boost in productivity because women and parents are not caring for children. They're in the factory. But then it'll catch up to you in like 10 years. And
Mm-hmm.
actually, this problem was exacerbated because then Stalin comes into power. There's terrors, there's war, there's the purges, there's just basically a lot of death, a very skewed sex ratio between men and women, like
Mm-hmm.
very skewed, which makes marriage very hard. And so there were a lot of orphan children, and there was a lot of just destitution, and basically this kind of idea of liberating women, which is how they sold the first set of policies, was just became a joke because of the sheer level of prostitution and again other horrible outcomes. And so in the 1930s and 40s, especially 1944 is going to be the key year for this new family code. They start to roll out so-called pro-family policy. Now, I call it so-called because it's very important for people to understand that this was not policy meant to strengthen families. Because again, from the autocratic perspective, it is very risky to allow families to function on their own,
Mm-hmm.
function privately, produce privately, we would say, right? You want to control that process because families can, they take away loyalty and resources from the regime. So what they essentially try to do is to subsidize out of wedlock childbirth. And they do this in a couple of ways. They make divorce very expensive. So like if you're married, like, yes, you have provision from, your husband and you're having children. That's great. But they also have a big push to house single mothers. They basically say if you give birth out of wedlock, the state can be listed as the father on the birth certificate.
Wow.
You don't have to list anyone. You just go right to the state, right, for that support. And so what this essentially does is it doesn't strengthen, right, what we would kind of call family life in the traditional sense. It just promotes, right, more disorder, quite frankly. And so even though they try to ban abortion at this point, they had legalized abortion in 1917, 1918. They try to roll that back. They try to pay mothers for having children. They tax childless people, and they actually try to tax people with even one child. They try all of these things that are actually starting to sound familiar now to Western ears because these
Mm-hmm.
ideas are coming back into the conversation. Really to no avail. It's hard to know, like, what, again, like if these policies weren't there, maybe something else would have happened. It's hard to know
So
the
let
counter.
me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but just so we've
Go
got a
ahead.
time period in mind, because when something happens in Russia is a big deal. Is this under Stalin? Is this pre their entry into World War II? Where are we at here?
So Lenin was really the first set of family policies. Stalin and then Khrushchev are the second set. So actually, there's
Okay.
good evidence, and this is why, like, the time horizon of the state will matter. Because again, you want to dismantle the family in the short run, you get benefit from it, but in the
Mm-hmm.
long run, it costs. So Khrushchev is actually looking ahead, thinking, "I'd like to be in power. Let's start to promote childbearing and
Right.
fertility, so that I'll have just a labor force, right, by the time I get into power." But it was under Stalin, 1944.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to interrupt your thought there. It's just one can easily get lost in Soviet discussions. It's
Oh, for
fascinating, but
sure. Yes.
I,
Yeah. To make that timeline clear. Yep. So really under Lenin and right after the revolution, we have those like dismantling the family policies. Then Stalin comes into power, and then Khrushchev is drafting these laws that come into effect in 1944. And then that really remains kind of the family policy stance of the Soviet Union until its fall. And again, and you'll hear a lot of people who study pro-natal, pro-family policy say this, there really weren't big results in terms of there wasn't an increase in childbearing. There wasn't a certainly not an increase in marriage rates, not a decrease even in abortion rates. It's the number one form of like birth control in Russia today. So just a lot of these policies were pretty unsuccessful.
wow. And so just to kind of clear any low hanging fruit out of the way before we go any further, what is there a standard critique to the individual says, well, yeah, that was the Soviet Union. Of course, people aren't having kids, even if they're incentivized to do. I mean, what are you kidding me? All they're going to interested in is drinking vodka and getting home from the factory as fast as they possibly can. Once they've got their standard quota production met for the week. If we tried something like that in a Western world where people aren't dying in Siberia or in the gulags, it would actually have an effect. Like it could have a positive benefit here because that's not their main concern. Um, is there a standard sort of we can in fact compare what happened in the cold winter of the Soviet Union to the Western world that we could see that we would likely have similar, I'll say, lackluster results if we were to try it here?
Yeah, so I would first say, what do we mean by try it? So the Soviet Union threw a lot of stuff at the wall,
Yeah.
trying to see what would stick. And there was a lot of stuff that I think is just outright kind of unethical, which was basically housing single mothers, monitoring them. They weren't allowed to leave. The medical kind of advisor would give them permission when they were allowed to leave. Lots of bad, right, bad stuff. But if you're talking about, so people will usually draw the example. So let's steelman this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like taxing the childless and or giving cash benefits to mothers with three or more, four or more, five or more children. Okay.
Exactly.
So something like this. The first thing to recognize is that under the conditions of the Soviet Union, um, the cash benefits were substantial, very substantial. And especially when you are at a lower level of consumption and lower standard of living compared to in the States, that was a substantial financial incentive. It would be very, very expensive to reach that size of financial incentive proportionate, right, to our increased standard of living in the United States. It would be outstandingly expensive. We're talking probably hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Hmm.
Um, very large cash benefits to again equate what those two things were. And now the question of would it work though, and I think that this brings up a really important point when we're thinking about the opportunity cost of having a child. Economists think about the cost of having a child not necessarily in the financial sense or the monetary sense, right? It's not just about being able to afford food, afford housing, education, clothing, all of those things. Those costs have actually gotten cheaper over time in relative terms, relative to wages. Those have become more affordable. But really, what's become maybe less affordable when it comes to children is that opportunity cost of your time. So as wages increase, especially for women, then what you're sacrificing is a substantial, not only like the career, like the wages you could attain in your career, but the experiences, right? Just building up, right? Basically investment, retirement, savings, all of this. So when we're thinking about the full cost of children, it's not even enough to maybe try to compensate people for the monetary outlays, but you would really have to basically come up with a policy, I think, if you wanted to get an increase in the birth rate, come up with a policy that pays enough to compensate women for their opportunity cost of time, which would be enormously high, virtually impossible, and unfortunately just exacerbate the debt problem that the federal government and state governments have.
So, wow, there's a lot of ways we could go here because I think we collectively have let the cat out of the bag somewhat of where I was wanting to go because a common critique of the, broadly speaking, I'll call it the nationalist populist right today, or the industrial policy pro-right, say, is they would agree with the first part of the conversation where you're talking about Soviet policy and the evil, unethical, wicked things they were doing to tamp down, to destroy the family, essentially. What a horrible thing to do through collectivist action. And they would probably, hurrah, hurrah, as you're talking about how it didn't really work. Look, it had all these long-term impacts, unintended consequences that were very disastrous. But it's a common, and I want to be careful here. I'm by no means accusing anyone on the right. Well, maybe there's some. Most of the people on the right today are not, in my mind, Stalinists looking to centralize things. But there is, I think, a tendency on the right to sort of say, yeah, but we're trying to use the state for good purposes. We're trying to build families, not destroy them. We're trying to build up the working class, not the elites, overseas workers, if you will. And again, we've kind of talked about this already, but I guess that's where, because if somebody's reading the description for this show, providing I don't put this information in there, and they just say, Clara Piano, she's an economist, she's probably fair to say she's pro, she advocates pro-family policies, say, they might be forgiven for saying, oh, she's a NatCon, she wants tax reductions for those who have children, she wants credits paid out to them. And yet you're saying, well, this stuff doesn't really work. And so I'm wondering, can you build on that for me? Have I got you wrong? Is this, put this another way, what does a pro-family policy look like if we're not talking about the kind of things that the NatCons typically are talking about?
Great. Yeah. So I wanted to say one thing too, one last thing about Soviet family policy and how we should just never bring it up in conversation when we're talking about things we should do. The one thing that they were unwilling to do was to lift the ban on religious marriage. And so even when in 1944, they were trying everything desperately, spending a lot of money, spending a lot of goodwill, because this was changing family policy every 30 years, 20 years is not, does not make you very popular. But they were not willing to lift the ban on religious marriage. And so it's important to know that there is an inherent tension between, I would say, almost any state and the family institution, which is that the family just will inherently take resources and loyalty away from that state, because it will make decisions that will impact leaders, impact the state, that are not controlled by the state, right? Decisions about fertility and the like. So now, what should we do? So I want to be also cautious in saying I'm not against like the child tax credit or anything like this, or even like small benefits to parents or paid parental leave, all of those things. I think there are better arguments for them that are not they would raise the birth rate, because I don't think that they would. I think there
Mm.
are better arguments on maybe like from just a justice perspective or something. And so I'm definitely open to that, especially something like retirement benefits for stay-at-home mothers, or um, one policy I've actually become really interested in lately. One policy change is letting children vote. So letting parents vote for their minor children. There's a paper we can maybe link to in the show
Oh,
notes.
okay. So giving parents an additional vote, not
The
letting little
idea,
4-year-old Johnny cross the box at the ballot.
yes, although
Okay.
it is the idea that children are people, right, and to enfranchise to give them a vote, I think is maybe again like a more logically consistent argument than just we should be giving handouts to people because they're doing things that we like. And here's the fundamental problem, I think, with pronatal policy or even pro-family policy. A, what conservatives or even Republicans mean by pronatal and pro-family is not the shared definition of pronatal and pro-family with a lot of our fellow citizens. And
Mm.
so when you empower the state to make these decisions about who counts as a family, who counts as a child, all of these things, that could lead to very difficult outcomes and conversations. Like I said, like for the Soviet Union, their ideal fertility was really out of wedlock fertility. Um, that was the most useful to them, was to be like the father. And so being careful about that. And then also um, noting that essentially there's no way from a policy perspective, there's no true way to know what the optimal population size is. And so trying to target a certain birth rate or trying to target a certain population, um, to my mind, doesn't make sense. It's like trying to plan the economy. It's like trying to know what is the optimal number of pencils to produce. Well, I don't know. We leave that up to the market. We leave that up to private households and private firms for a very good reason, which is that it depends on local information. So I'm much more comfortable with saying, let couples decide, right? They have that local information, but let's just remove any barriers, right? Let's make sure we don't have our finger on the scale against deciding for children. And I think that there are a lot of ways that actually a lot of things could be done policy wise that aren't new policies, just kind of reforming old or decrepit or like barriers to fertility in ways that could be pro family and pro-natal in a de facto sense, even if it doesn't have like a flashy like check right attached to it as a new policy.
And I do want to get into some of those because I know you speak often about the fertility gap. But before we skip to that, because of what you had just said, I'm sure it's not gone unnoticed by you that there are many, on the left and right, because sometimes you'll hear the arguments on the. Why am I blanking on the guy's name that was the first to bemoan the population bomb and the.
Paul Ehrlich.
Yes, one of the
Yeah,
worst predictors in human history. But
not
yes, but there's the reverse of that sometimes on the right. Maybe not in that extreme, but I'm thinking of I don't know if you've read, for instance, Mark Stein's America Alone, or he's written a lot about this. I used to be far more of a Mark Stein connoisseur. He's seems to be on a bit more of an intellectual journey of late. But some of the things he's written, I think, are interesting. And a young Josh Lewis, I just really gravitated toward his arguments, which was essentially the West is depopulating. It's the title of that book, America Alone, was that at the time our birth rate was 2.1, I think, which is like the perfect number you need to maintain population. Um, women need to have 2.1 children in order for the population to not go down, but it's not going up either. In all of Western Europe, and especially in Russia and Japan, that was the reverse was true. Population was going down. And essentially, it was just arguing, look, this doesn't take too much longer, and the cultures of Western society are going to morph into those immigrant populations that have essentially outbirthed them. And he very much was saying, to be fair to Mark Stein, I don't think he was saying here is the optimum population, but rather he was saying depopulation is a problem. This is it's not only hurting us from an economic standpoint that we have fewer workers, and so in things like entitlements, we're not going to be able to afford them, but it's even depleting our culture because we are no longer family being the number one transmitter of culture to the children. Well, what if we're not having the children? We're just not able to keep up these norms and these institutions we hold dear. That being said, I'm wanting to ask you, I want to press a little bit into that. it sounds like you're almost rejecting, at least from an economic standpoint, you're almost rejecting this notion that we should be fearful or cautious or um, actively working to, say, increase the population from the lens of what's good for the nation state. Now, maybe we could talk about it on an individual basis. There is a fertility gap. I know you're for more children because more people want children, say, than what's happening. But have I got you right that you're not as concerned, or you think it's actually a misdirection for us to be focused on this sort of, well, we need the entire national population to come up for economic and cultural reasons?
Yeah, I'd say it this way. So there are going to be negative economic consequences and certainly negative public finance or fiscal consequences to declining or shrinking populations. And of course, national security concerns. But I want to say just a couple of statistics. So the United States actually has our total fertility rate currently is 1.6. And that's pretty low. That is below replacement, like you said, that
Yeah.
2.1, even 2.18. That is really the number with mortality and taking into effect a couple of
So it's
other.
really 2.2.
Yeah, yeah. And so it is very low, but that's still actually above most of Europe, and it's the highest really in most of the high income countries, and actually fertility in almost every country of the world is falling. And so a lot of the countries where we receive immigrants from, so India is an example, Mexico, a lot of Latin American countries, a lot of East Asian countries. There's a saying that they are getting old before they got wealthy. So they are seeing significant, very rapid population aging and fertility declines. And it's happening much faster than it has happened in the States or the UK, for instance. And so it's important to know that it's not like the US, it's not just a US problem. And actually we're
Right.
situated a little bit better than most, right, than most
Right.
countries. So I'm not worried about it so much from that perspective. I do think that we could, um, that we will fare better than other countries where they just don't have, again, the wealth that we have, don't have the infrastructure, all of this. Um, Now, that being said, why am I not maybe as pessimistic as other people? Well, I don't think that, I think it's 100% okay to say we would like to help couples have the children that they would like to have. I'm very concerned on two grounds about maybe a policy that says we are targeting this birth rate for national security or for national reasons, or we would like, even in the Soviet case, we would like women to have at least three children, because
Hmm.
I don't think that that is the role of government, right? This is really just a limits of government kind of argument, in the same way that we can't say, every family should have only a ration of like three steaks every week. I just think that we need to think about it this way. This is a private decision. People are responding to information that they alone have. And it's really important to let that decision process be complete. So, but now let me get back to some of the economic consequences. So people are the ultimate resource. And so what does it mean to be in a world where fertility is 1.6? It's going to mean probably lower standards of living over the long run. It's going to mean fewer ideas and less innovation, absolutely. And so it's also going to mean fewer programs of social support. Social security is a big one. And so I
Hmm.
do think it's okay to be concerned about those things. And I do think it's okay, right, to have to make policies, right, to fix those specific problems. What I'm saying when I say that we cannot know the optimal population is I don't think that having pronatal policies of every woman should have at least four children is the way to go, right? I don't even think that's the way to solve the problem.
That definitely
Let
sounds a
alone,
little
yeah,
Soviet-esque.
yeah, let alone the ethical issues aside.
So, because on that same note, I think I like what you said there, because I've also heard you in other podcasts talk about this. You also don't take the view that overpopulation is about to kill us, right? In fact, it's almost more of a, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I almost get the sense of, if anything, it would be beneficial if the population was going up, even if this, we're not trying to control how many children on average each woman has, but it would be good if in developed countries at least, possibly developing countries, and you said this, but I want you to return to it because I think it's a concept that just evades the mind most of the time. Is that people are a resource in a sense. Like I think the very standard way of thinking about this. I know when I was younger, I thought of it as like, well, there's more mouths to feed. That's less resources because there's more people consuming those resources. So how is it rather counterintuitively that if we have more people running around, somehow we have more resources?
I'm glad you asked this because this is something I try to mention in all of my classes, even like a principles of microeconomics, because it's important to understand, I think, the real insights that economists have given us, given the world, when it comes to population growth. A lot of this is coming from the work of Julian Simon, but even just modern macroeconomic theory and a recent Nobel laureate's work, Paul Romer, work on human capital and just interest in innovation and things like this, um, reveals, we've discovered, right, that people are the ultimate resource, meaning that you cannot explain differences in standards of living or GDP per capita and production across countries if you do not take into account the ability of people to innovate and to invent and really to act on their ideas for doing more with less. That is the root of economic growth and prosperity. It's not labor and it's not capital in like these kind of like stale terms. So what do I mean? Well, a common way this has been described is yes, people are an additional mouth to feed, but they're also additional hands to work, right? So they're going to
Mm,
be providing extra labor, but they're also additional minds to think and to solve problems. And I think that that's actually really been underplayed by a lot of other disciplines, but economics, because we're trained to see the unseen, has noticed it and said, actually, when you have more people, you have different ideas. You have new ideas that are bubbling up all the time, ideas for startups, ideas for energy efficiency, ideas for security, all of these things, ideas for in my own life, right? Inventions that make my life as a mother of two easier, right? Like baby holders, travel strollers, all this crazy stuff, right?
right.
People are coming up with ideas to serve my needs, right? And we have the institutions in place to reward that, right? So again, they make a profit, to return to our earlier conversation. And so this idea that people are the ultimate resource, it's because other people have had ideas that they can act on and that I can kind of reward them, right? I can purchase their products for when I think that they're providing value to me. That is going to be allowing standards of living to grow. So if you have fewer people, it is absolutely true. And again, I don't think overpopulation concerns were warranted for the reason that in most cases, these were children that the couples decided to have. They wanted to have them. So I don't think that the government should say everyone should have four kids. I don't think the government should say people can only have one, right? I think
Hmm.
those are both not the way to think about this problem. And so we will have fewer ideas, and that is concerning, right? And that is something that we need to think about. And again, I do think this is why we need to pay attention to any barriers to couples, right? Having the number of children that they would like to have.
Which is where I want to return. Couples having the number of children they would like to have, because I think if I'm hearing you correctly, that is the fertility gap, right? Or at least in your mind, it's not. Well, there should be 500 million Americans, not 330. That's not the fertility gap. It's that. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong, but the evidence shows, on average, couples desire more kids than what they actually have today. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's worthwhile to be specific about this because sometimes people can be skeptical of survey data that talks about how many things people want, right? Like, okay, but here's why I think it's worth paying attention to. No matter how you ask the question, so you can ask the question, what is the ideal number of children, which is probably going to pick up some like cultural norms, things like that. You can ask the question, how many children do you desire, or how many children do you intend, or how many children rank on a scale of 1 to 10 over these different options, 0, 1, 2, 3, etc., all the way up to 6. How happy would that make you? And then let's take a weighted average, right? So there can be very sophisticated measures of desired fertility or even intended fertility. No matter the measure, actual fertility measured by the total fertility rate, which is that where you get that 2.1 number from usually for replacement population, actual fertility is below that. So in every US state, the smallest fertility gap is actually in South Dakota, it's 0.3. But in every US state, there's a positive fertility gap, meaning that the average woman, and it's usually women that are surveyed, unfortunately. So the average woman says that she would like to have or be happiest with more children on average, like I think it's 0.45. So a good number of children, right? One more child than she currently or is projected to have, given the fertility rates. And so I think that is why I am interested in what is preventing, right, couples from having the number of children that they either intend to have or would be happiest having.
So let me, I guess first point of clarification. Predominantly or almost exclusively women being asked, do we know, because I start off by saying couples want this, do we know if there's an equal proportion of men saying the same thing, or do we just not know?
Great question. So there is data. So yeah, I said unfortunately women, meaning only women, it would be ideal, right, to have men's responses as well and even be able to match them as couples. Is data. There's one paper in particular that I reference a lot called Bargaining Over Babies, which looks at both men and women as a couple and whether or not each of them would agree to having another child. And what they find is that you find a birth when both members of the couple, right, both spouses say, yes, I would like to have another child. Then you get a birth. You don't usually see a birth in the data if it's one. So there's this
Okay.
veto power. And then who is most likely to be vetoing, who is saying that I disagree when their partner is saying agree? It's actually women. And so women are more likely to disagree to having an additional child on average and across different countries. So actually this applies to Europe as well as the United States. And so this is telling us that maybe our estimate of the fertility gap is conservative, right? Because if
Hmm.
maybe there's the male member of the couple is saying, actually, my happiest number would be even higher, right? And so then we're probably giving you a pretty conservative estimate of the fertility gap by just looking at women's responses.
So, and help me understand here, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, but the standard answer oftentimes for a couple to say, here's why we're not having more kids is financial, right? Or the constraints of the finance. Now, I don't want to besmirch anybody who has, especially a family, financial constraints. But in certain measurements, I think we're in the most prosperous nation, the most prosperous era in human history. And it seemed like our ancestors didn't have problems having more children. So, is that a true statement? Do they mean different things when they say that? Like, what is? I do want to know what is, in your opinion, maybe the main barriers. But to what degree is this financial thing an actual concern or barrier?
Yeah, so I think it is a real barrier in some circumstances, but I first want to note that you are absolutely right that compared to historical circumstances, it has never been easier, never been cheaper. You've never had to, in some ways, sacrifice less to have children. And actually, what I usually point out is that infant and maternal mortality have been going down drastically for decades. And so actually it's never been safer, right? So a lot of
Hmm.
women were facing like you could die, right, having children historically, and now we're not as much. But why, right? Why are people so concerned about these pressures? So a couple of things. There is evidence that it is hard for young couples to find housing that they would like to raise a family in. So usually this is a single family home with like some sort of yard. So that could be really holding back couples. Housing regulation might be playing a role, house prices, people not moving out of their houses, all of this. There's also evidence that labor market rigidities, so young people not being able to have stable jobs or well-paying jobs, that would make it, not necessarily financially smart to start a family at this time, right? So there are some real considerations. And I think that's, again, why it's so important to let couples act on that knowledge that they see, right? Okay, so make those decisions themselves. Um, Now, what are the real barriers? So I mentioned too, right? So there's some housing. There's difficulty in finding housing, difficulty in finding jobs, but ultimately, from the economic perspective, we can think about couples saying this as saying, I value, right? I'm willing to make this trade-off. I would like to have a child, but I value, right, this financial benefit or the way
Right.
my life is right now, right, more.
Hmm.
And so we can focus on the cost side with jobs and housing. We can also focus on the benefit side, saying, okay, well, what if you understood the value of children in a different way and that it ended up tipping right the scale and in the child's favor? And so that's where some work on understanding high fertility, high education women comes into play. So Dr. Pakulik has a good book on this that just came out called Hannah's Children, and looking at, okay, how do couples think about the benefits of children? Because some couples see children as like eternal, right? So I am not only giving birth to like a human, but like they're going to live forever, right? And so that actually would tip your calculus, right? Even if you're giving up a lot of stuff, right, in favor of having more children. And so there are things that we could do, right, to promote maybe religious organizations or promote other things that help people maybe value children, because it's hard to know if you would enjoy having children, right? It's hard actually to make those calls because children are experienced and you don't really, there's not a comparable, right, kind of reference point. And so paying attention to both sides of that equation, costs and benefits, I think is important.
So, in a possibly final question here, I think I've got this right, or at least back in the day when the American fertility rate was 2.1, I think I'd heard that the developed world, to the extent we could call them the Western world, that had the highest birth rate. Did I say mortality rate? Birth rate, whatever, whatever it said. Highest birth rate was the nation of Israel. I don't know if it's still that way or not, but it was a positive birth rate, meaning they were actually increasing. Um, and I've never heard a strong argument necessarily as to why that nation and not Western Europe, Russia, Japan, United States. And I guess tied to that, I'm curious. We've talked a lot about economics and policy, but how much of this fertility gap, if you will, how much of it is a policy issue and how much of it is a cultural issue? Like, is there something beyond just the mere economics or the politics? Um, and I'm not trying to confuse things by pulling Israel in, but I just thought it might be an interesting launch pad if, in fact, they could be a vision of an alternative path. Um, is there something about culture that actually could resolve these issues where policy never could?
Mm. Yeah, no, you're right that Israel is an outlier case. So they're outstanding in the sense of they are a high income country where fertility, I think, is three children per woman, which is
Wow.
outstandingly high just in objective measures at this point, even compared to much poorer countries. So um, that's really um, that's really setting them on a great trajectory. And the question of policy and really the interplay between policy and culture is complicated, and it's something that I'd like to study further, because they definitely do have some what we would call pro-family or pro-natal policies, like paid parental leave, or just kind of general infrastructure that's family friendly. But it's hard to know if that's coming from just a culture, right, that promotes children and values children, or if that's causing a culture that promote, or probably both, right? And so I do think that if we think about culture as just kind of generally what is rewarded or praised, right, in society,
Right.
or maybe uh, or vice versa, what's disapproved of, then there definitely is value. I think there's a lot of evidence that maybe emphasizing the praise for children, the praise for the work of parenting, the work of being a mother and a father, is a very promising route, because I'm concerned about, right, like the financial state of the government. And so it's relatively cheap, but B, it seems like it could be more effective because people really do care about what other people around them think of them, and they care about how other people see them. And there can be like a critical mass probably of people, once you're having kids, to start creating even spaces like physical infrastructure that just makes it easier, right? More parks, more family friendly venues, restaurants, whatever. That stuff really does matter. And so I'm pretty optimistic about thinking of creative solutions, right? Instead of doing something that might seem a little easier, maybe like cutting a check, but thinking really deeply. Okay, what are the real constraints here? What are ways to hold up the most important work, honestly, right? Mothering and fathering, in a way that looks like that we're telling, right, the next generation that this is so worthy of praise, right? This is something that you could get good at. This is just an honorable way to spend your time, right? In the same way that we do for like, you should go to college, right? Or you should get an
Right.
education. I love that. I absolutely love education. But I also think a lot of these people, the college students I teach, they're going to be parents, right? Telling them, it's very honorable to have a career and or, right? Be a full-time parent or a part-time parent, whatever, right? To make sacrifices for your family. Both are honorable paths. And so, yeah, to put it briefly, I think Israel is definitely doing something right, and it'd be very, very cool and important to study them more deeply when thinking about the future of pro-family policy.
When you've had a chance to do that, I'll have to have you back on the podcast so you can tell us what it is they've gotten. They've gotten better than we have. But Clara, it's been my privilege to talk to you. This has been a very interesting conversation. I've never thought much about Soviet family policy, and that is a really fascinating topic. And I'm glad you've enlightened us somewhat there. So, Clara Piano, thank you for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephants podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.